ABC General Hospital Spoilers reveal that the confirmation of Willow's crimes did not arrive in a dramatic courtroom confession or a tearful public breakdown. It came colder than that: clinical, documented, undeniable. Medical reports were reviewed. Prescription records were analyzed. Testimonies aligned. The pattern was too precise to dismiss as misunderstanding. Drew had not been fragile and dependent by accident. He had been kept that way, sedated, isolated, controlled. And once that truth solidified, the carefully constructed narrative Willow had built around herself collapsed with stunning force. For months, she had convinced herself that everything she did was necessary. Every pill measured, every door locked, every lie told, it had all been, in her mind, an act of protection. She believed she was preserving stability. She believed she was shielding her children from chaos. But when the evidence surfaced, stripped of emotion and justification, it revealed something far darker: intent, the staged medical crisis, the manipulation, the confinement. What she had framed as devotion was now being named for what it truly was. The confirmation spread through Port Charles like a shockwave. Allies recoiled. Enemies watched with quiet vindication. Law enforcement moved swiftly, assembling warrants, preparing for arrest. The city that once saw Willow as compassionate and resilient now whispered a different word: criminal. And Willow felt the shift immediately. She sensed it in the silence of unanswered calls, in the hesitation in familiar voices, in the way the air itself seemed heavier, charged with impending consequence. The illusion of control she had clung to evaporated overnight. There would be no more adjustments, no more strategic recalculations to maintain the upper hand. The system was closing in. Fear does not always paralyze. Sometimes it ignites. The idea of arrest, of handcuffs, interrogation rooms, prison walls, did not terrify Willow as much as the thought of losing Wiley and Amelia. That was the fracture point. If she was taken into custody, the children would not remain with her. Custody battles would erupt. Judgments would be passed, and she would be reduced to supervised visits if she was granted access at all. The life she had fought to preserve would dissolve entirely. So another thought began to take shape. Quiet at first, then sharper. Leave. Not just temporarily. Not a brief disappearance to regroup, but a complete severing from Port Charles before the law could reach her. It was irrational. It was dangerous. It was, in her mind, the only remaining option. The logistics alone were staggering: passports, transportation, timing, but desperation breeds a kind of ruthless clarity. She began moving through the house with unsettling calm, gathering documents, monitoring flight schedules, calculating how long she had before the warrant became public. Every sound outside made her pulse quicken. Every passing car felt like surveillance. And then came the most dangerous layer of the plan. If she fled alone, she would be branded a fugitive. If she took Wiley and Amelia with her, the situation escalated into something far more severe: kidnapping. She knew that. She understood the legal implications in precise detail. But in her mind, the narrative twisted into something survivable. She wasn't kidnapping them. She was rescuing them from separation, from a broken system, from a future without their mother. The distortion was subtle, but powerful. It allowed her to proceed without fully confronting the moral abyss beneath her feet. As the pressure intensified, Port Charles began adjusting in response. Law enforcement prepared containment strategies. Michael grew increasingly suspicious of Willow's unusual behavior. Friends who once defended her began exchanging worried glances. The situation was no longer contained within private scandal. It was erupting into full-scale crisis management. The adjustments spiraled into madness. If Willow vanished with the children, the city would mobilize. Airports alerted. Borders flagged. Media headlines exploding with urgency. Every agency would be drawn into the hunt. The act would not be quiet, it would detonate. And still, she moved forward. She rehearsed explanations for the children, softening the truth into something digestible. A special trip, a surprise adventure, a new beginning somewhere warm and peaceful. She imagined tropical destinations, distant coastlines, places where no one knew their names. She convinced herself that once they were gone, once distance replaced danger, everything would stabilize. The storm would calm. But storms do not calm when you run into their center. The night before she planned to leave, tension in the house became suffocating. Drew, now clearer and stronger as the medication faded from his system, began to speak more openly about what had happened. His voice carried not only betrayal, but clarity. That clarity terrified Willow more than any siren ever could. If he testified, if he described the confinement in detail, the case against her would become airtight. She was out of time. As dawn approached, A new adjustment unfolded, one so reckless it bordered on self-destruction. Instead of carefully orchestrating a legal defense, instead of surrendering and fighting for custody through courts, Willow chose chaos. She packed hastily. She silenced her phone. She prepared to take Wiley and Amelia before anyone could intervene. And in that choice, the final line was crossed. The plan was no longer about preservation. It was about escape at any cost. Port Charles would not respond passively. Michael would not remain unaware for long. Authorities would escalate. The search would begin immediately. And every mile Willow put between herself and the city would multiply the severity of her charges. The shock would not simply be that she fled. It would be that she transformed from accused manipulator into active fugitive in a single, irreversible decision. As she stood at the threshold, suitcase in hand, children still unaware of the magnitude of what was unfolding, one truth loomed larger than all others. This was not a strategic adjustment. It was a collapse. The unraveling was complete. The woman who once believed she could control every variable now found herself sprinting toward uncertainty, dragging innocence into a storm of her own making. And as the sun rose over Port Charles, illuminating a city bracing for explosion, the consequences of Willow's confirmed crimes were no longer theoretical. They were in motion. Michael did not unravel all at once. The madness crept in slowly, like a crack spreading through glass, until the moment he walked into a house that was too quiet and felt something inside him fracture beyond repair. Wiley's laughter was gone. Amelia's toys lay untouched. The silence was wrong. It pressed against his chest until breathing felt like effort. When the realization hit that both of his children were gone, not at school, not on a trip, not somewhere safe, but simply missing, something primal awakened in him. This was not panic. It was fury wrapped in terror. The adjustment that followed was immediate and volatile. Michael's mind began racing through scenarios at brutal speed. Airports, private planes, border crossings. Every possibility felt both too slow and too late. Willow's name echoed in his thoughts, not as a partner, not even as an adversary, but as the architect of a nightmare he had underestimated. If she had taken them, if this was her desperate attempt to rewrite the ending before the law closed in, then time was no longer measured in hours. It was measured in seconds. Obsession took hold. Michael stopped thinking strategically and began thinking instinctively. He needed power. He needed reach. He needed resources that extended beyond police protocols and legal boundaries. That meant Jason. That meant Sonny. He did not hesitate. Pride evaporated. Old conflicts dissolved in the face of something far more urgent. When he reached out, his voice carried a rawness that left no room for debate. His children were missing. This was no longer about rivalry or control. It was about survival. Jason responded first, calm on the surface but already calculating beneath. He understood this kind of crisis. He knew how quickly a situation like this could spiral into permanent loss. Surveillance networks activated. Contacts were alerted. Quiet inquiries began moving through channels that official authorities would never admit existed. Sonny, equally electrified by the threat, shifted into a different kind of mode, protective, ruthless, decisive. The idea that his grandchildren had vanished ignited something dangerous in him. And that is when the true explosion began. Michael's desperation collided with Sonny's intensity and Jason's precision. The city felt it. The undercurrent changed. Word spread that something had happened, that lines were being crossed quietly and rapidly. Sonny began leveraging favors. Jason tracked movements at airports and docks. Michael hovered at the center of it all, spiraling between hope and dread, his thoughts looping in relentless patterns. What if they were already gone? What if Willow had prepared this for weeks? What if this was not a moment of panic, but a carefully constructed exit strategy? The more he imagined the distance growing between him and his children, the more unstable he felt. Every minute without confirmation twisted the knife deeper. His imagination turned vicious, painting worst-case scenarios in vivid detail. He replayed every argument with Willow, every sign he may have missed, every moment he underestimated her capacity for extremity. Guilt layered itself over rage. Jason tried to anchor him, Sonny tried to direct him, but Michael was no longer operating from logic. He was operating from fear sharpened into obsession. He began pushing for faster, riskier actions. He demanded immediate movement. He insisted on following leads before they were verified. The pressure mounted. Voices rose. Tempers ignited. This was no longer just a search. It was a storm building momentum. If Willow had indeed taken Wiley and Amelia out of Port Charles, the implications were catastrophic. It meant premeditation. It meant deception. It meant a level of planning that made this far more than a spontaneous escape. And if authorities labeled it kidnapping, the response would escalate beyond anything Michael had imagined. Sonny's world thrived in escalation. The combination of a desperate father, a calculating enforcer, and a ruthless patriarch created a volatile triangle. Each man brought something different to the crisis: emotion, strategy, power. Together, they formed something explosive. And as their search intensified, so did the ripple effects. People began to notice unusual movements. Associates whispered about heightened security. Contacts were questioned aggressively. The city's underbelly stirred. If Willow thought she could disappear quietly, she had miscalculated the scale of response. Michael's mind, however, did not find comfort in that. He paced. He replayed memories of Wiley's small hand in his, of Amelia's sleepy smile. He imagined them confused, asking where he was, wondering why everything had changed. The thought that they might believe he had abandoned them was unbearable. That is when the obsession sharpened into something darker. Michael began contemplating actions he once would have rejected outright. He told himself that recovery justified any method. If Willow had crossed into madness, then he would match her intensity with something stronger. There would be no restraint, no hesitation. He needed his children back, no matter the cost. Jason saw the shift and recognized it immediately. This was the edge, the place where grief morphs into recklessness. Sonny, too, sensed it, though part of him understood the instinct. Family above all else. Protection at any cost. And as leads began to form partial sightings, flight logs, fragments of confirmation, the tension reached critical mass. The next move would determine everything. If they intercepted Willow before she crossed international borders, there might still be space for negotiation. If they were too late, Creatum's search would expand into something global. Michael stood at the center of that expanding chaos, eyes hollow with exhaustion, heart pounding with volatile determination. The disappearance of his children had not only destabilized him, it had detonated something far larger. Old alliances were reforged. Boundaries blurred. Strategies hardened. This was not simply a missing persons case. It was a war igniting quietly beneath the surface of Port Charles. And Michael, once controlled and calculated, was now fueled by a singular, unrelenting obsession: bring them home.